Hi, my name's Annette Perot, and I'm a licensed psychologist in private practice in Durham, North Carolina. And I specialize in my work with anxiety disorders, OCD, and what we call obsessive compulsive spectrum disorders, including hoarding disorder. In addition to my clinical work, I am one of the founding board members and officers of OCD North Carolina, which is our state's affiliate for the International OCD Foundation. The focus of the program, Loving Someone with Hoarding Disorder, that you're about to watch, is really geared for people who have a loved one with hoarding disorder or where there's a concern that that might be the case. And at the same time, I've recognized that some of you who are watching this might be mental health providers or other healthcare providers. Some of you may be dealing with hoarding disorder yourselves. And whatever it is that brought you to watching this program, I hope that you find it beneficial. And thank you so much for being here. Given that each of us watching this program will have, varying amounts of knowledge already about hoarding disorder, I think it'll be helpful for us to start by getting on the same page in terms of, what we're referring to when we talk about hoarding disorder. So when we refer to hoarding disorder, what we're talking about is significant difficulty parting with possessions due to a perceived need to save items or experiencing significant distress in parting with possessions, where the result is clutter in living areas such that that space is no longer able to be used for its intended purpose, and in a way that causes significant distress or difficulty engaging in daily activities. So somebody who might not be able to sleep in their bed because it's covered with possessions, or maybe prepare food because they can't get to the refrigerator. And while one of the criteria for hoarding disorder is not about acquiring, in reality, about 90% of the people that have hoarding disorder also have significant difficulty in terms of significant acquiring of possessions. For some people, that was an issue previously, and that part is no longer something that gives them significant difficulty, but they still have difficulty parting with possessions, and so the resulting clutter is still what's problematic. In terms of acquiring, people do that in a number of ways. It might be purchasing things at retail stores, yard sales, thrift shops. It might also be acquiring free things. So when you at a store can buy one, get one free, or people picking up free items at I think about the state fair, and there's various booths where people can get items for free. It might also be more passive acquiring. So things that come into the dwelling without the person necessarily asking for that. So mail, including junk mail, catalogs. It might be people giving, whether it's gifts to the person or giving items that they no longer want because they know that the person, will probably be interested in taking them off their hands. So lots of different ways that people acquire items. It's also true that for some people, they might steal items, although that is much more rare. And really important to keep in mind that hoarding behavior or clutter might occur for reasons other than the person having hoarding disorder. So, for example, somebody who's experiencing major depressive disorder might, lack the energy or the motivation to be, putting things back where they need to go, or to be, getting unwanted items, out of the home. And so things may accumulate and create some clutter, but for very different reasons. And that'll become clearer as we're going along. And so it really highlights why it's important to consult with a professional who works with hoarding related issues, who can help determine what the source of the behaviors are and kind of the function that it serves in the person's life, so that you make sure that you're addressing the particular, the actual issue at hand. In terms of a little background about some things that we've come to know about hoarding disorder, about 2 to 6% of the population, we estimate, experiences hoarding disorder. And that's been based on information gathered in lots of different countries, although I will say that the majority of information that we have about hoarding disorder, including its treatment, has been done in the United States or various European countries. Much less of it has been done elsewhere. And the majority of people who have participated in research studies have been white. And so what we don't know is how much some of the things that we have come to know from research studies, how much of that is also relevant and true for people who are in other parts of the world, and for people of color in the United States and elsewhere. And so it's going to be really important to continue to be gathering more and more information over time to see the degree to which some of this holds to be true more broadly. It oftentimes begins in early adolescence and tends to get worse, progressively worse over time with each decade of life. It gets to the point where people oftentimes reach a diagnosis and seek treatment. Like the majority of people who are seeking treatment for this issue are, in their 40s, 50s, and older. The majority of people who seek treatment actually also tend to be female, although we have reason to believe that the occurrence of hoarding disorder is pretty equal in males and females. There's some studies that have indicated that it occurs more in males, but more of it really would suggest it's pretty equal. It tends to run in families, and it's not just in terms of the environment that somebody's in, having an effect on that, but also in terms of genetic studies, that we believe that there's a genetic predisposition that people have toward hoarding disorder. It doesn't account for all of the occurrence of hoarding, for sure, but that is certainly a factor. And it often occurs along with other mental health issues. And so would be much more atypical for someone to only have hoarding disorder. It is much more likely that the person has some additional kind of what we call comorbid or co-occurring issues. And that's pretty important because it has a big impact in terms of some of the challenges in people addressing these issues, as well as the need for treatment to be, focusing on a variety of those co-occurring issues. And some of those issues that can go along with hoarding disorder, over 50% of the people with hoarding difficulties also experience major depressive disorder. A significant number of people experience attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, the inattentive type of that versus the more hyperactive part of that. And that's going to become a little clearer about why that might be a little bit later. And then it's very common for people to experience other kind of anxiety-based issues and anxiety disorders, such as generalized anxiety disorder or social anxiety, can be common for people with hoarding issues. Less than 20%, only about 18% of people with hoarding disorder also have obsessive compulsive disorder. And that's pretty important because some of the early information that we that we had about hoarding disorder was done when we thought that hoarding disorder was a subset of obsessive compulsive disorder. And so oftentimes they'd be looking at people who had obsessive compulsive disorder who also had like the aspect of that, which was hoarding disorder. Part of what we have learned over time is that these are actually two very distinct, separate issues, and quite different in terms of what contributes to the issue, as well as the treatments that have been found to be effective for OCD are not actually found to be effective for hoarding disorder. In addition, the parts of the brain that we think play a role in OCD are different from the parts of the brain that we think might be, contributing factors for people that have hoarding disorder. We're going to talk a little bit now about some of the consequences of hoarding disorder. And this is one of the mental health issues that has an impact both for the individual who has a hoarding disorder, as well as for loved ones, and has really significant effects for communities as a whole. For the individual experiencing hoarding disorder, some of the consequences can be social isolation or strained relationships that occur over time, as individuals in the person's life are frustrated, understandably, about the issue occurring and the impact that it has. Also, people experiencing significant risk of fire or falls or health issues. Sometimes we'll see things like lung-related problems, breathing problems due to a lot of dust, the accumulation of that, or mold, or things in the home. A lot of legal and financial problems can occur, particularly if people are purchasing a lot of their possessions and significant, spending of financial resources. There can be problems due to, a lack of resources for other things that somebody might need to be using that money for. In addition, people, will be losing things within the clutter, including checks that need to be deposited. And so you can see how financial problems can occur. Property damage can occur, particularly when there's a lot of possessions in a particular area of the home that is impacting the structural integrity of the space. And actual or threat of eviction can be an issue. One of the things that's really interesting is that there's an Australian study that was done that found that while hoarding-related fires were pretty infrequent, I think it was like 0.25% of the fires were hoarding-related, that they accounted for 24% of fires that involve loss of life, which makes perfect sense if we think about one of the impacts is people having difficulty exiting the dwelling quickly. Oftentimes people, when it gets to a more severe level, people being able to get in and out of doors or windows, that oftentimes those areas can be blocked with possessions. And so pretty devastating consequences when that occurs. The impact for those of you who are loved ones of someone with hoarding issues will likely vary significantly based on a number of different factors, including whether you live or ever lived in the home where hoarding was present, as well as your age at the time. But the thing to keep in mind is that everybody, all of you who are loved ones, are impacted in some way by hoarding disorder. And these are some common effects that hoarding can have for loved ones. It'll be similar, the consequences, similar for the person with the condition if you're living in the home, in terms of difficulty using the space for the intended purpose, difficulty into risk of falls and things like that. But in addition, for loved ones, oftentimes people will talk about having a loss of a normal childhood or life, and life as they hoped it would be. It can involve barriers to developing relationships. So, if you imagine growing up in a home where you feel shame, embarrassment about the condition of the home, and therefore, are much less likely to invite people over for play dates or to have a sleepover or to have dinner. Or maybe you don't want to get too close to people because here's this thing you don't really want them to ever come to know about you and your family. And so it really impacts the development of more close interpersonal connections. And a lot of emotional distress, not only shame, but a sense of fear. Are we going to be, found out? Am I going to be removed from my home and my family if they find out that, one of my parents has hoarding issues? A lot of frustration and a feeling of powerlessness, particularly when people have been trying for years and years to help their loved one recognize and address the hoarding issue to no avail. It's really understandable that people become more and more frustrated and feel a greater sense of powerlessness. And it's pretty common when that occurs for people to then begin responding to the person who has hoarding issues with criticism or hostility. It's part of what we refer to as expressed emotion. And it can also be the case that for people, they might respond with accommodation, what we refer to as accommodation. And what we mean by that is when an individual will start doing things differently in order to accommodate the mental health issue, in this case, hoarding issues. And so somebody might be purchasing additional items when an item is lost because it's somewhere within all of the clutter, or getting a storage unit for the person with hoarding issues when there's like no more space in the home to store things, or eating on one's lap if there's no room at the table to eat. And so people started making accommodations. And sometimes people will vacillate back and forth between criticism and hostility to accommodation. And both of these ways of responding are completely understandable. People who accommodate oftentimes do this because they are trying to keep the peace and not upset the person with hoarding issues. However, both of these patterns of responding can have a really big impact and have a tendency to increase the hoarding behaviors. And so really important for loved ones to keep this in mind, that it's going to be important to be figuring out how can I be responding to, my loved one with hoarding issues in some ways that maybe are going to be a little bit different than that. And another, common effect can be caregiver burnout. It's just that over time, it takes such a toll to be having a loved one who has hoarding issues. And really important to be getting support from oneself. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. Loved ones are left with so many questions, including why? Like, why does my loved one with hoarding issues continue to be acquiring more and more possessions? And why do they have so much difficulty, getting rid of possessions? Why is this happening? And so let's talk a little bit about, some of the things that contribute to hoarding disorder. I like to think about this like a little bit of an iceberg. And so on the one hand, Clutter certainly, when it comes to hoarding disorder, creates significant problems in someone's life. However, it's also really important to not just focus on the clutter. The clutter is the manifestation of the issue, it's the visible outcome. However, what's really important is everything that's beneath the surface, everything that you don't see that contributes to people developing hoarding issues and the maintenance of the issues. And so it's really important to be better understanding that part. And what we're talking about are a variety of factors, one being vulnerability factors, things like a family history of hoarding, other mental health issues that somebody might have, family messages about possessions. So, one that comes to my mind is the adage of waste not, want not. In addition to some current constraints, things like space, time, and health issues that impact, the degree to which somebody's able to be going through their possessions, putting things away, things like that. Stressful events or traumas in a person's life. And so we know that trauma is a major vulnerability factor. In fact, there was one study that found that people with hoarding disorder were twice as likely to have a history of trauma than individuals with OCD. In particular, exposure to trauma is more likely to result in greater emotional attachment to possessions. And so that's a really important risk factor. Interestingly, people that have hoarding disorder are not likely necessarily to have post-traumatic stress disorder. So that diagnosis isn't necessarily connected with hoarding disorder. However, the experience of having traumatic events occur is. And it's led some people in the field to be postulating that perhaps hoarding disorder may serve as in some ways, buffer from the development of post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, that doesn't mean that that's a particularly effective way to be dealing with trauma, but it may serve a protective factor from the development of PTSD. Other factors that are important, information processing issues. And so things like attention, the degree to which someone's distracted or over-focused, categorization issues, difficulty with figuring out kind of like what categories to put various items in, and also like what to do with them, and an over-reliance on visual cues. So having a tendency to want to keep things out and visually see them in order to remember to do certain things or remember that you have certain things. Difficulties with decision making, not just about possessions, although certainly about possessions, but decision making in general can be a factor. And then what we call associative or complex thinking. So, a water bottle lid for someone who doesn't have hoarding issues, that person might think, oh, I'm done with drinking the water from the water bottle, so I'll just, get rid of the lid, throw it away, or put it in recycling. For someone who has hoarding disorder, they might be able to think about all sorts of additional uses for that bottle cap. And so it might be like, oh, this could be a cat toy, or I could put a little paint in there when I'm working on a craft project. The more varied uses that somebody can come up with for a particular object, the more important it might seem to that person that they hang on to it. And so that kind of associative or complex thinking can play a role. And then the meaning of possessions is also really important. It can be things like sentimental reasons. Getting rid of the cards that people give me would mean that they don't matter to me. or perhaps some different beliefs about responsibility or waste. The idea of like getting rid of it would be wasting a valuable opportunity, or I should save it for someone who might want it. Beliefs about memory. If I don't keep it out where I can see it, I'll forget about it. Now, oftentimes people with hoarding disorder worry about having memory related issues, but in fact, the research doesn't support that their memory is significantly different from people who don't have hoarding issues, but it's more their perception that they need to rely on things being out in order to remember things. That's key. It could also be some messages about the utility or uniqueness of items. If I get rid of it, I might need it and I'm not going to have it, or I won't be able to find another one just like it. In addition, emotional reactions. So it can be a variety of different emotions, pleasant as well as unpleasant emotions. For example, somebody finding just like the just the thing that they were looking for at a flea market might bring up excitement or feeling really proud of the fact that they worked hard to be finding that item. That is very reinforcing. In addition, the idea of parting with possessions, especially when they have like really strong beliefs about the importance of hanging on to those items, the idea of parting with a desired possession brings up a lot of unpleasant emotions: sorrow, grief, loss, fear, and that's very reinforcing of not parting with a possession in order to avoid the unpleasant emotions that it brings up. In addition, using acquiring items as a way of dealing with unpleasant emotions. So somebody might have a really difficult day at work, and then on the way home, they might feel a really strong urge to be stopping somewhere and seeing if there are any things on sale. The idea being like, okay, then I can get away from the unpleasant feelings that I'm having and feel better by shopping and finding things that I would like. And so people managing emotions, what we call kind of like emotion regulation. If somebody doesn't have strong emotion regulation skills, so other skills, more effective skills at managing unpleasant emotions, it is going to be likely that they will rely on the skills they do have, the coping skills that they do have, which could be relying on using possessions, acquiring possessions, and hanging on to possessions as a way of managing emotions. And like I was saying, these things are very reinforcing. So people get into these reinforcement patterns, which lead them to be acquiring more, saving more, or not parting with possessions to a greater degree. And that results in more clutter. And so no surprise if you have all these different factors, vulnerability factors, trouble with information processing in various ways, lots of different beliefs that are strongly held about possessions and the purpose they serve, the strong emotional reactions that people have, and that getting reinforced over time. No wonder it would result in lots of clutter and more possessions. And the more possessions that people have, it's harder to keep them organized. Even if somebody had the skills to be organizing their possessions, and people with hoarding disorder, because of the information processing issues, oftentimes do not have the skills to be effectively organizing their possessions. Even if somebody had the ability to do that, the more possessions you have, it's really increasingly difficult to have enough space, time, energy to be effectively organizing all of those possessions. So it makes perfect sense how it is that people are going to then have a lot of clutter, have difficulty with this issue, and over time be developing hoarding disorder. So another common question that loved ones have is what can be done about hoarding disorder? And how can I help my loved one? You know how on a plane they say in the event of an emergency, put your own oxygen mask on first? There's a reason why they say that. We are not going to be able to be helpful to someone else until we start by taking care of ourselves first. And it's a part of why one of the most important things to be doing as a loved one of someone with hoarding disorder is to really be focusing on good self-care. It cannot be said enough, and it's really important for you to hear that you are not responsible for causing nor fixing your loved one's issues with hoarding. You're not responsible for causing or fixing your loved one's issues with hoarding. That doesn't mean that you can't be of assistance along the way, but it's really important that if you are to be helping in some way, that you're in a place where you're able to be doing that and choosing to be doing that. You are not obligated to be doing anything to be helping fix this issue. Really, really important to be getting support for yourself. Earlier, when I was talking about the impact, not only for the person who has hoarding disorder, but also for their loved ones, that's really important to be recognizing my loved ones' hoarding issues have had a significant issue for me. And it's going to be important to be addressing the effect of those issues. And also getting support for yourself if you're continuing to be in a situation where you're living with someone who has hoarding issues. And so it may involve you being in therapy yourself or having a really good social support network, but really important to be getting good support. Also, really important to be mindful and clear regarding your boundaries and limits. And so, should you be at a place where you've worked through enough of the effect of the hoarding issues so that you're in a place where you're able to be helping your loved one, that doesn't mean that that's without any boundaries or limits. And so it's going to be important for you to be clear within yourself about those boundaries, as well as to be able to communicate that with your loved one. And so it might involve saying something like, it's important to me to have our children over for Passover and for us to be able to all sit together at the table. And so I'd like to talk about a plan for how and by when you could clear off the table so we'll be able to do that. That would be an example of making a clear communication with a loved one about your boundaries or what you want in the situation. Another example might be, you asked if I'd be willing to help you look for your lost binoculars in the pile of things you have in the living room. I noticed, though, that whenever I help you look for lost items, I end up feeling really frustrated and get cranky with you. And that's not really good for either of us. So I think it would work better if I don't help in that way. But how about I make you some lunch when you want to take a break from what you're sorting through? So we can be loving and supportive without doing more than what we really feel able to do or are willing to do. And then in addition, doing things to be helping manage your own emotions. So your own emotion regulation. And there are lots of different things that people do in terms of emotion regulation skills. For some people, they have a regular exercise routine, and that really helps manage their mood. Maybe somebody does yoga or they do various relaxation exercises, mindfulness meditation, things like that. One thing that I have on here as an example is something called 4-7-8 breathing, and that's certainly a very useful thing. I was going to have us practice with that one, but I think I'm actually going to have us practice with a different breathing exercise. And so let's go ahead and practice that. And it's called box breathing or square breathing. People call it different things. And what's involved is that you will, after exhaling to start with, you're going to go ahead and inhale to a count of 4, and then you're going to hold that for a count of 4. You're going to exhale for a count of 4, and then hold that for a count of 4. And so it makes a box or a square. Inhale, hold, exhale, hold. And so let's go ahead and practice that. So So let's talk for a moment about some general tips for when you're doing things to be helping a loved one with hoarding issues. Language matters. And so really working to use respectful language, which would include, for example, not referring to somebody's possessions as junk or trash. It can be helpful to use the person's language. So if they prefer to refer to their possessions as, possessions, for example, you might use that. Or if they refer to them as treasures, then it's using that term. You don't have to feel the same way about their possessions to be respectful and use language that resonates for them. And really, regardless of what the value is of the possessions, really being respectful about how you talk about it. In addition, really helpful to consider not referring to the individual as being a hoarder. It's a common thing that people will use, that they'll refer to somebody as being a hoarder. And in reality, it's like the person has hoarding disorder or they have hoarding tendencies, versus they are not their condition. They're a human being who has a condition. We don't typically talk about people who have cancer as being like a cancerer, but that they have cancer. In addition, really working to avoid touching someone's possessions without their permission, or without some conversation about that. And I'll give you a couple of scenarios. Sometimes people will say, well, gosh, why don't we just either go in and just have a mass clean out and just get rid of everything that is, and a greater amount of clutter in the space. For one, forced cleanouts really don't work, other than a short-term changing of the environment. When they have happened, it's typically resulted in, after a short period of time, things being back to the way that they were, or with even greater clutter. And so the most you gain is a short-term change of the environment. In addition, the significant amount of distress that forced cleanouts cause results in, at times, worst case scenario, there have been people who have died by suicide, or died by a health related issue in terms of that's connected with the significant stress and distress and trauma that can occur with a forced clean out, that can result in great consequences for the person. So really not a good idea, if at all possible. Now, there are times when an entity might get involved in the situation, like, for example, if there's a violation of codes, various codes, and code enforcement has to be involved where like there's a fire hazard, or somebody's renting space and they're going to be potentially evicted. There may be times where a more massive intervention needs to occur. However, if that needed to happen, really good to be doing that in consultation with a mental health professional around how can we do this in a way that's going to be the least traumatic for the person involved. Typically, that's going to mean also let's do it with that person involved in the process. Let's also see if we can work with the entity around having there be some greater amount of time that's realistic in order to be doing it in a way that's going to be most helpful or the least traumatic. But also what I'll hear families sometimes talk about is, hey, maybe we'll just like slowly be removing more and more things. Whether it's like done in a massive way or slowly over time, removing possessions and getting rid of things, there's a greater risk in jeopardizing the relationship, because there's a breach of trust in doing it in that way. Far better to be working on having conversations around the issue around, hey, like, here's something that I'm wanting to have happen, or it's really important to me in order for me to be able to do the hand washing. It's really important for me to be able to have the space where I do that be free of other things. And so it would, it would be great if you would be willing to have things be, gone from that space, so that I could be working on the hand washing. Or it would be, in order for me to be able to prepare food, I really need the counters to be clear of the stacks of things. And so what would be an amount of time by which you could have those things be off of the counters? And then, if it's not happening, to be saying, I need them to be, I need things that are here to be gone and somewhere else by, like, within the next couple of hours, so that I can use the space. If it's not gone, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to put those things in a box and I'm going to put them in, whatever, on your side of the bed or in your closet or wherever, like, pick a place. So that the person knows kind of, here's what the expectation is. Here's what's going to happen if we agree on something and it's not done, or if I'm needing the space and it's still like that way, here's what's going to happen next. So they can make a decision about what they want to do in response to that. Also really important to keep the other person's strengths in mind, that this is something that they have a lot of difficulty with, but it's not the totality of who they are as a person. That they, like everybody, have strengths and have things that are more difficult for them. And when we keep the other person's strengths in mind, it helps us to be remembering the whole full person, which helps to kind of temper our frustration a little more. It also is something that may be useful for them for us to be able to share with them, because sometimes the thing that is a strength for them may also be part of the difficulty, but they may be able to draw upon the part that's a strength in ways to address the issue. I was saying earlier about, you don't want to be jeopardizing trust in the context of like touching possessions, but in general, really working to be maintaining a relationship of trust. One of your best allies will be maintaining a good, positive, trusting relationship. When that happens over time, your loved one who has hoarding issues may, I say may because it's not a guarantee, but they may be open to the idea of making some changes, hearing your concerns and the impact of the hoarding on you. They may be open to getting help for their hoarding related issues. When trust is broken, it's going to create much more hostility, much more frustration and unpleasant emotions for everybody. And the person's going to be much less open to addressing the issues, letting you know about what's going on and what they're having trouble with, getting help for it. And the stress involved in a fractured relationship will only likely serve to exacerbate the hoarding. Also really important to affirm any progress that's in the desired direction. Quite often, because frustration has built up over time, what can easily happen is that loved ones, there will be some amount of progress, but a loved one is scared to be hopeful about that, or scared to like view it in a positive way, for fear that like the other person will just kind of revert back to kind of the undesired behaviors. One of the best things that we can do, though, is to be affirming any amount of progress. So if you think about in your own life, a common thing can be somebody's wanting to be, I'm just going to say they're wanting to be exercising more. And then, imagine if you were wanting to be exercising more and you made some progress. Maybe you're not exercising at all. And let's say you exercised once during the week for maybe 15 minutes. If your loved one said, well, but it was only one day, I mean, like, that's not going to really do anything. Or, well, it was only 15 minutes, and why didn't you do it for longer than that? That is not going to be very motivating for you to be exercising more days of the week or for longer. And so, when we instead respond with like, hey, that's terrific, or how did that feel? What was it like for you to be able to do that? Or, hey, I really appreciate the time and energy that you put into doing that. Or I know that was hard for you to do. Way to go on hanging in there with it. Like, being encouraging is one of the best ways that we can be encouraging additional progress. So I was saying earlier, also about like a little bit earlier, I said may lead to progress. One of the things that's really important to keep in mind is that anything you do as a loved one holds the potential to be helpful to the person with hoarding issues. However, it is not a guarantee. You do not have the ability to make your loved one with hoarding issues change, to be able to make changes, to be open to getting help to make changes. You can ask for what you want. You can be clear about what your boundaries and limits are. You can be doing all the right things, and that person still may not be at a place where they are ready to be making changes or to be getting help around that. Now, I'm going to say a couple of things in a moment about some additional things that you can be potentially doing that may be useful. But it's really important to be having realistic expectations and recognizing that you don't have nobody has the ability. I, as a therapist, as a psychologist who works with people with hoarding disorders, hoarding disorder, don't have the ability to make somebody make changes or on a certain time frame. I can do various things that set the conditions in a way that might increase the likelihood, but ultimately each of us governs our own lives. And unfortunately, that means that people living in the home, may at the end of the day decide at some point that they're no longer willing to be living with the conditions being in that way. And that is an incredibly difficult decision for loved ones to make. And also an understandable one at some point along the way, because each person needs to do that about what their limits and boundaries are. Okay. In addition, avoid arguing. It's really common for people to get into arguing about the value of certain possessions, whether or not it makes sense to keep it or part with it, where it should be kept. Instead, it can be really helpful to ask questions and come from a place of seeking to understand kind of where they're coming from, or better understand what's making them do the things that they're doing. And so, for example, rather than saying like, why are you keeping this? You might say, can you share with me a little more what leads you to be keeping this? Or rather than saying, why are you keeping this here? Or why are you keeping this, to be asking, why are you keeping it here? Or tell me what's leading you to keep it here. Validating the person's feelings and their experience. You don't have to see it the same way to be acknowledging what you're hearing them say about their experience. And so expressing, okay, so from what you're saying, it sounds like, I'm just going to make up an example. From what you're saying, it sounds like for you, it feels really important to keep these various, takeout containers, because you want to make sure that you have enough for times when people come over and you want to send them home with leftovers, right? So you might not agree with the number of them that they're keeping, but you're expressing an understanding about why it is that they're feeling like it's important to hang on to ones. When any of us feel heard, when we feel validated and heard about what our experience is like, it goes a long way for reducing defensiveness and making it more likely that we're going to be able to hear the other person expressing their perspective. And so you can really help by validating their experience. It's going to make it more likely they're going to be able to hear yours along the way. And also being clear and objective in describing the issues and coming from a place of concern. And so rather than talking about like, gosh, why don't, this place is a mess. Far better to be saying, so there are a number of papers that I'm noticing that are stacked up and on the floor. And my experience is that what can happen at times is that the stack gets bumped and then various papers are spilling out onto the floor in ways that I'm concerned will be a slipping hazard for you or for me. And I would really hate for one of us to get injured. it's subjective. It's talking about like the observable things and the concern about what can happen as a result. There are various reasons why people might be reluctant regarding getting help. And so I think it makes sense to touch upon this for a moment. Lots of different strong emotions of shame, fear, feeling hopeless, feeling overwhelmed, individuals feeling angry, maybe angry with their loved ones for being on their back about this. And so the more someone is feeling angry about how they're being treated about this issue, it increases the likelihood that they might be more reluctant to be addressing it and kind of dig their heels in. But also, one of the things that sometimes people will believe, kind of a myth that people hold, is that the person with hoarding disorder, is just lazy and they don't want to work on this at all. And certainly it can be true that somebody might be avoiding working on it at all. That may be the case. Quite often, what actually happens is that somebody is spending time or has a history of spending time trying at points to be addressing the issue, but they don't get anywhere. And so they do what we call churning, where they might pick an object up and then they're having difficulty deciding, whether or not to keep it, or if they're going to keep it, where, what to do with it. Or like they know where they want it to go, but they can't get to their closet yet to put it in the closet. And so they feel kind of paralyzed and they set it back down. And then they pick something else up and they go through the same process and they set it back down. So they're spending time trying to make progress, but they're not getting anywhere because they don't have the skills that they need to be able to do it differently. And then, after you go through that process over and over and over again, pretty soon you start feeling hopeless. Like, what's the point in even trying anymore? Because I don't get anywhere. In addition, even for the people who are ready to be getting help, one of the huge barriers is a lack of providers. Now, there can be a lack of resources in other respects too, in terms of somebody having the finances to be able to get help. But in addition, even when people have the financial resources to get help, we do not have enough people who work with hoarding disorder. And that presents a huge challenge, because even when people want to be able to make progress, if they do not have the skills that they need to be able to do it different. So earlier when I was talking about information processing issues, for example, if people don't have the skills to be overcoming those information processing deficits, it's going to be really difficult, if not impossible, for them to be making headway. So they may be able to temporarily make some changes, but it's not going to stick. So that's important to keep in mind. Also, when mistrust due to fractured relationships makes it hard for people to be acknowledging that they have an issue and to be seeking help. Poor insight regarding their condition. Now, for some of the people, they may be denying that they have an issue, or saying, gosh, like you're the one with the problem. Like, there's no problem. I don't have any difficulty here. I don't have hoarding issues. I don't have too much stuff. For some of those people, they may be saying that, but really it's an issue of they feel tremendous shame, and it leads them to be more defensive and to be acting as if they don't have an issue. But really, for some of those people, and I know because some of them, I'm working with, they come into the office and they talk about how much shame they feel. They acknowledge that they have difficulty. They just feel so ashamed that they can't acknowledge that to anyone else. Now, for some people, it is actually the case that they have very poor insight into the issue. What's fascinating is that people with hoarding disorder, for some people, they truly do not see it the same way that other people do, nor do they see it the same way that they see it when they're looking at pictures of the space. And so um, quite often someone will, there are times where I might have somebody take photographs of the space, particularly if I'm not able to go to their home early on in treatment, um, to be able to work there with them, that I will have them take photographs so that we can be talking about and working on the issues together in the office. And when they take pictures and then they look at it, they'll say, I just for the first time, like, have such a sense of, oh my gosh, I didn't realize it was quite this bad. And so when they're looking at it in the actual situation, they have a very different experience of it than when they're looking at a photograph of it. And that doesn't happen for everybody, but certainly that can be the case. And then there are other issues too that can interfere in someone getting help, like physical limitations, other mental health issues. In addition, it may not seem like this issue, while it's a really big issue, may not actually, for that person, feel like it is the most important issue or biggest issue for them to be tackling. If somebody might have significant financial issues that are weighing on them and feel like an even greater issue at the moment, just as an example. In terms of treatment or help, when we talk about help for hoarding, we can be looking at working with somebody who's a loved one. So working with you, the loved one of someone with hoarding disorder. It can be working with the person themselves with hoarding disorder. And then it can also be community-based interventions like a task force. And there are various communities that have task forces, and they serve a particular role. We're not going to get into time talking about that piece of it. We're going to focus more on with those with hoarding disorder and with you, the loved ones of someone with hoarding disorder. In working with a loved one, it could be supportive therapy regarding the impact of what it's like to have a loved one with hoarding disorder, or to have grown up in a home with someone with hoarding disorder. In addition to that piece, it might also involve what we call harm reduction. And so there are people who will come into work on this issue wanting to be getting some help in how they can work with their loved one who has hoarding disorder from a harm reduction standpoint. What harm reduction means is doing things, you're not intervening on the issue overall, but you are working on aspects of it, targeting aspects to reduce the harm that can be caused by the issue. So, for example, I work with loved ones in helping them to work with their, person who has hoarding disorder on making changes in the environment, like keeping possessions away from fire sources in the home, heat sources. So keeping things away from hot water heaters, from the furnace, from the stove, from radiators if people have an older home that has radiators. So it's not going to be intervening on the issue. There's still going to be a lot of clutter that's in the home, but it is making smaller changes that reduce the more serious consequences of the hoarding issue. Things like physical harm that can come from people tripping and falling, or from a fire. It might also be, another example of harm reduction would be working with them around keeping things away from the entrances, exits of the home, and windows, so that if somebody either did need to evacuate more quickly, they would be able to do that. Again, that reduces the harm. It could also be somebody being willing to keep wider paths in the home so that if emergency personnel needed to come into the home, they would be able to get a gurney in to if somebody needed to be transported by to the hospital by an ambulance, for example. In addition to harm reduction, working with loved ones can also involve what we call family as motivators training. And it's working with the loved ones to not only be, there's a harm reduction component, but in addition to that, there are other components too, including a main piece of it is training loved ones around motivational interviewing skills. Motivational interviewing is an approach that therapists will at times use and be trained in to be working with somebody who is not as motivated for treatment when they come in. And so it's working with them in ways that may, and again, I say may, increase someone's motivation to be making changes. And while we as therapists use motivational interviewing in our work along the way at times with clients, loved ones can also be gaining those skills so that they can be communicating with their person with hoarding disorder in ways that may increase that person's motivation to be making changes or to be entering into working on these issues along the way. Now, somebody could gain all of those skills and be using them in beautiful ways, and their loved one with hoarding disorder may still not be open to making changes or to be getting help for the issue. But it is one of the best shots that people have is when we are feeling more motivated, we are going to be more likely to make changes and to be seeking help. And so great skills for people to be having, to be gaining. In addition, we work with those directly with hoarding disorder. Now, ideally, somebody would be doing the cognitive behavioral therapy that's been designed specifically for hoarding disorder. And it's been developed by Gail Steketee and Randy Frost, some of the leading people in the area of hoarding disorder. But, and when that's the case, when somebody's going to do that, sometimes that's done individually in therapy, working with a therapist who specializes in hoarding disorder. In addition, though, there are what's called buried in treasures workshops, and it's using the many of the same tools that we work on individually with somebody, with a therapist, and using that in a group, and also delivered by somebody who's potentially a layperson who's trained in the Buried in Treasures workshops. And so these workshops are in various places in the country. And so that can be really a valuable resource for people. Sometimes somebody might not be interested or open to being in therapy, but they may be interested in doing a Buried in Treasures workshop. And that's a great way to be gaining skills to be working on these kinds of issues. There's a resource sheet that is online with the materials for this training, for this workshop right now. And on that resource sheet, there's some information about Buried in Treasures workshops. And so that you might check some of that out or Google that and look online. In addition, when I'm working with somebody with hoarding disorder, if they are not receptive to the cognitive behavioral therapy that we have currently, which is one of the main approaches that we have, they might be open to harm reduction, a more harm reduction approach. And I realized that I failed to say a little bit earlier, A great book, a great resource for family members is the book Digging Out by Michael Tompkins, and I'm forgetting the second author right now. But that's on the resource sheet as well. And so you might check that out. And it goes over a lot more in depth in terms of harm reduction as it's applied to hoarding disorder. Or when I'm working with somebody, I might also be working in terms of motivational interviewing skills, particularly even with the people who are most motivated for treatment when they come in. Motivation can really decrease along the way and go up and down. And so that's always a really valuable thing to be a part of a component of treatment, particularly for hoarding disorder. And then compassion focused therapy, I just mentioned this on here. It's a newer thing that's being used for hoarding disorder. And so that's another approach. I just want to mention it on here. So thank you so much for participating in this workshop, and I hope that you have found it useful. If there are additional questions that you have, feel free to reach out to me on my website. You can use the contact page on there to send me a message, or call me, and I will do my best to get back to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.